Hello and welcome into another episode of Half Court Press. He's Wilson Moore. I'm John Walker. It's been a while.
It has been. It really has been.
It's been, some would say, I would say, too long.
I would agree with that. I would also say it's been a month and 3 days.
It's been a month and 3 days since our last episode. A lot has happened since then on Wilson's side of I-80 and on mine in Omaha. We're recording in the World-Herald studio today, as always. It's good to, one, be back, Wilson. Two, have that be in person instead of over Zoom or anything. And that's because we have a lot to talk about. Nebraska completed its roster. Both Creighton and Nebraska had guys in the NBA Combine. Creighton has another marquee exhibition set up for next season. The Jays are already in the board with the 2026 class. It's just been a lot. It's been one thing after another for the last month. Alan Huss was finally available for the first time to the media. And we're going to talk about that and everything else over the next half hour or so. So buckle in. Enjoy the ride. But before we take you on it, before we start the car, one, put your seatbelt on.
As always.
Of course. Click it or ticket.
That's right.
And two, how are you, Wilson?
I'm doing pretty well. You know, it's weird kind of adjusting to... I mean, I guess the season's been over for quite some time now, but like...
Yeah, but then you go right into the portal and...
Yeah, and that ended like less than a month ago.
Yeah.
You know what it's like? It's like when in like the 1600s, like the merchant ships would get back to port.
Okay.
And the sailors, like, they've been out at sea for the past 9 months, and they now have to adjust to life on land.
Sure.
So I feel like that wasn't a real... I feel like you're not totally on board with this metaphor.
Yeah, like, you know, when you go up into space and, you know, and your bones have to
you get it,
compress again when you land back on our...
adjusting to life on land right now.
That's good.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Adjusting to life on land, whether we're an astronaut or a sailor.
Yeah.
One of the two.
Yeah.
We've sailed the seas of the first month of the off season.
We have.
And it's been eventful, as we mentioned. Let's start here. Let's go back a little bit since our last episode, because shortly after that, I believe Nebraska added Pat Monaghan.
That's right.
As an assistant.
Had that not happened when we?
Maybe it had.
Maybe it had just.
But
happened.
He was available.
Yes.
Much like Alan Huss was.
Yes. A couple weeks ago, we spoke to him for the first time.
How was that?
It was good. You know, interesting background for a guy who has never had a high major job before.
Right.
You know, that's, I think, interesting. You know, he's never had a high major job, and he's never been a head coach before. You know, which kind of two of the, I don't know. It sticks out to me because I think that's a somewhat unique background to have. And, you know, what we knew about Pat Monaghan going in was he is just a guy who has, you know, just gradually worked his way up the ladder. You know, you can see how linear his development has been in just, you know, GA at Wayne State, then JUCO, then D2, then D1, you know, mid-major, you know, Horizon League, Mountain West, you know, just gradually moving on up the ladder. And I think that's kind of what we got. And, you know, I knew a little bit about him because I wrote about him in the weeks before, talked to some old head coaches that he had worked for, and it was generally the same review from everyone, which is just like very, very hard worker, you know, like kind of one of those like maniacal work ethics, you know, knew what he wanted to do and where he wanted to go from very early on. And I think we kind of saw that, we got that sense from him in talking to him. Just someone who is focused, you know, someone who's done this before in terms of, you know, jumping in head first on a new staff. And, yeah, you know, just he was very straightforward of, you know, what he wants to do, what he wants to accomplish. I know it didn't take long. He's on the road. I got on the road pretty
right into
quickly.
it.
Yeah, I mean, every coach is on the road these days. You know, I think they want him to be one of their better recruiters on that staff. That was one of his calling cards at the mid-major level, and I think they're banking on that. So yeah, I think you know, you can definitely see his skill set, what he plans to do. You know, he again diverse skill set. He worked with big men at his most recent stops. He was a guards guy before that. So just someone who can plug some holes on that staff and is just, very focused, ready to go, was my sense.
That's kind of what it seemed like. I read your story. He was hired the day before our last episode, I believe.
Okay, so that
or maybe the day of. Yeah, so very, very soon. Yeah. Very close to our previous episode. But that's not the only staff change.
Yeah.
Not an addition, if you will, but a change that Fred Hoiberg made because the Huskers now have a general manager in Luca Virgilio.
That's right. Yeah, I think I think there are kind of a couple facets to this. One is I think there are two very notable things. The fact that Luca Virgilio got this job, and the fact that this job now exists at all.
Yeah.
And Luca's a guy who, obviously very, guy who Fred Hoiberg trusts very much. He is, I believe, the only person on that staff who was there when who came with Fred from the jump in 2019.
Yeah.
And he's a guy who makes sense in an administrative type role like this. His background is in that sort of thing, player personnel, and he was director of ops before that. So someone who made a lot of sense. He's obviously someone very familiar with Fred Hoiberg, with this program, with what they want out of guys. So it makes sense to have him, making, calling the shots like that. But I think the honestly maybe more significant piece of this, as I alluded to, isn't necessarily the fact that Luca Virgilio is the guy Nebraska went with, but the fact that they decided this was a position that they needed to have on their staff. That points to the changing world of college basketball.
Yeah.
It points to the, increased importance of specialization and roster building, and especially with a program like Nebraska that builds as heavily as it does out of the portal. And the nature of that means, they're assembling a new team basically every year. They've added 8 new guys this season.
It's more than half your roster.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's what sticks out to me more than anything is the fact that this is now a position in Nebraska men's basketball. He is the first general manager in the history of this program, which makes sense. And I just think this is the direction college sports is moving. And I think if you look at last season, I don't think there's any denying Fred Hoiberg is a very good coach, but there were some portal acquisitions last year that did not work out. Gavin Griffiths, obviously, Raleigh Wooster, Braxton Mia were both good players in a vacuum, but did their skill sets really mesh with what Nebraska needed with how they like to play? I don't know.
Probably left some meat on the bone there.
Exactly. So I think, just seeing that and seeing that, this is more important now than it's ever been before. Nebraska decided it needs someone who can specialize in that, who that can be their main thing.
I went to go write a story about this mid-season, and then I think Creighton stumbled and had the Pop Isaacs thing happen, and so it got lost in the wash. But I was going to write about general managers and where they stand in college basketball nowadays, because you have guys like Fred Hoiberg, like Greg McDermott, like Coach K, right? Not that they're in the same tier, as coaches and Final Four. Disregard all of that for a moment. At the end of the day, when those guys got into the business 20, 30, 40 years ago, Tom Izzo, guys like that, they weren't dealing with all of this.
No.
They didn't sign up to speed date for months in the off season. Recruiting used to be, okay, I'll spend a couple of weeks on the road at this circuit or this, that.
Add three new guys a year.
Yeah, sure. Maybe, right?
Yeah.
And 2 of those are freshmen.
Yeah.
If you go back 10, 15 years ago, if you see a transfer on someone's roster, it's like the talk of the team.
Yeah.
It's like,
what happened? That guy get kicked out of his last school? Yeah.
Exactly. So that's not where it is now. Fred Hoiberg, Greg McDermott, Coach K, Tom Izzo, phenomenal basketball coaches in their own right. when they got into this, they did not sign up to also
Yeah.
be a general manager,
Yeah.
you know? And that's it kind of comes with it. Roster construction has always been a thing. It's way, way, way different now than it was even 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It's just an entirely different world. And I think that we've seen a lot of programs in the country start to move to this GM model so that their coaches can be coaches.
Yeah.
And obviously that doesn't mean they just neglect the roster construction, but that means in, let's say, December, February, you can have a guy who sure is important as an assistant, but isn't vital to what you do on game days. You can have that person fully dedicated year-round to the portal, to retention, and that's huge. It's
Absolutely.
crucial for all of these teams nowadays, especially a team like Nebraska that for the past few years has built through the portal, and a team like Creighton this year that is entirely reloaded through the portal after losing one of the best players in program history. It's just vital to these teams nowadays. And I think as much as Luka will be that for Fred Hoiberg, that is maybe one of the underrated parts of Creighton also bringing in Alan Huss. In the immediate future, or let's take a step back. In the long term, big picture, you have your Greg McDermott successor. He handpicked him at that, which I think, and Huss said this when he talked a few weeks ago, Mac deserves to do that. Like, he's done enough at Creighton to be able to handpick his successor. And obviously, Creighton's president Daniel Hendrickson thought so, as well as athletic director Marcus Blossom. That'll be down the line. That's in a year or 2, 3, whatever it is. Mac said when the time's right. In the immediate future, you get a guy who was recruiting at a high level at High Point. You know what I mean? Like, if you can get guys to High Point, you can get guys to Creighton. And so that's immediately what you get in Alan Huss, is a guy who thoroughly understands roster construction from his time in the high school ranks all the way through his time as 6 seasons on Greg McDermott's staff at Creighton. Previously, there was 2 years at High Point, and now, again, back at Creighton, where he'll have to recruit and construct the roster at a high level. So it's huge. It's huge, all of that to say. And it's important for Nebraska. It's important for Creighton. It's important for a lot of schools around the country because, as you were saying, that is such a vital part of your program now. Like, if you can coach all day long, but if you start the season with a poor roster or a poorly constructed roster, you're doomed. You can only coach that roster so much. Like, you can only pound so many square pegs into a round hole before your hammer breaks or before you can't fit anymore. And when you have these odd pieces, which often happens because you're speed dating this time of year, trying to get a kid before someone else can, that tends to happen pretty frequently, unfortunately. I guess that'll take us into Alan Huss.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. You spoke to Alan Huss for the first time.
I did.
He has been, since he's back at Creighton.
I did. He was a delight. He was a pleasure. I talked to him over the phone shortly after Creighton announced that he was coming back and was the successor to Mac and this, that, and the other. I talked to him on the phone shortly after that, and he was a blast. He was phenomenal. Like, we talked about Kansas City barbecue. He's a Kansas City guy. We did that before we even talked about basketball, just to give you a feel for what kind of guy Alan Huss is. And yeah, he was as phenomenal talking ball as he was talking barbecue, which is hilarious to say. And it's just so fascinating because he has fully embraced the adaptability part of this. Like, you see a lot of coaches. I just mentioned Coach K. I know it's not basketball. Nick Saban. Things changed so much that they didn't want anything to deal with it. They were probably ready to be done anyway.
Jay
Wright. You have all of these coaches who are like, I'm good. This isn't what I wanted. Like, this isn't what I've done for 30 years or whatever. And rightfully so. Alan Huss is not going to be one of those guys. Yeah. The interesting thing that stood out to me is he said the only sign that he had on the walls of his office at High Point was just a sign that said CEO, change equals opportunity. Okay. Yeah. Well, how about that? I don't know if that sums up the mindset that you have to have in this era well enough. Like, it's necessary. Because if you're not willing to change, whether that's in roster construction or in NIL, in philosophy, depending on what league you're in, like you're gonna play in the Big Ten way different than you do in the Big East. Obviously, you're gonna play way differently at High Point than you do at Creighton. You're gonna fail. Yeah. Like it's that simple. Yeah. If you're not willing to change, you're going to fail in whatever that facet is. So that was my main takeaway from that. That's one of the things that really stuck with me, because we talked about it a little bit on our previous episode, because he was hired. They had already announced it at that point. We know that Alan Huss is the former Creighton player who's coming back, and when he was at Creighton, the better part of 3 decades ago, like he was the hustler, he was the grinder, like he didn't play a lot of minutes, but he knew his role, he perfected his role, and that was the guy Alan Huss was. We've talked at length about what he's done, whether that was in the high school ranks, at High Point, this, that, and the other. But none of that really matters anymore. It does to a degree, right? Like, it's cool. But none of that matters, because now it's like, okay, you are the guy. Like, you're the associate head coach at Creighton again. You're the successor to Greg McDermott officially. And so now the pressure's kind of on a little bit. And I think he'll handle it based on the way that, again, he spoke when we talked to him for the first time. And he's already had an impact, because Creighton's roster isn't complete like Nebraska's is. And we'll get to that in a second. But Alan Huss, much like Pat Monaghan, immediately got on the recruiting trail when they were hired. And since then, since our last episode, the Jays have added 2 players. One, Howard transfer Blake Harper, the reigning MEAC Player of the Year. He won that as a freshman, by the way. What? What freshman wins their conference player of the year?
That's a sign of why were you in that
conference
to begin with?
And Howard's close to home. He's a DC kid. Howard's somewhat close to home for him. Is close to home. So it makes sense in that regard. And what didn't make sense is after doing that, he wasn't pursued that aggressively in the portal by a lot of top teams. I think his final 4 were Creighton, LSU, Ohio State, and a return to Howard. That was it. And he only visited Creighton out of those 4. Obviously, Howard. I mean, he spent a year at Howard. But he didn't visit LSU or Ohio State. And
it would be fun if someone, took an official visit to the school they were already at.
Yeah, that they were leaving. It's like,
what do you do? This is our practice gym.
I don't know. What do you do? But it was confusing why he wasn't pursued that aggressively in the portal. And then he's 6'7", 210 pounds, kind of a point forward. And I think he might be closer to 6'6" than he is 6'7". But he's a swingman nonetheless, who made a lot of his money last year, and I guess in the portal this offseason, driving literally driving the lane, getting to the free throw line, rim running. So the question, it seemed, was, is that going to translate to the next level? Is he going to be able to drive against UConn like he did in the MEAC? No, probably not. And I think that shied away some of these teams, but certainly not Creighton. So now the roster is almost complete, depending on the Fedor Zugic situation that we talked about before we hopped in the studio today. Is so up in the air that nobody really, really, really knows what's going on. And that comes down to Fedor. That comes down to Greg McDermott. Like, nobody thoroughly, truly understands what's going on in that situation. That we'll talk about here in a little bit. Because then the Jays added their first pickup of 2026 in Storm Lake, Iowa native.
That's not a real year.
No.
It's next year.
No.
Well, it's weird to me. Like, I mean, that's a kid born in 2008. Like, that's not right.
What were you doing in 2008?
2008?
Yeah. You'd have been, what, 9?
I mean, 8.
Would have been 8.
December of 99.
Sure.
I don't know. I guess I was in second or third grade.
Okay.
I guess you were too, because we're the same age.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I don't know. I mean,
gluing something in a notebook.
I was in Mrs. Tuthill's class in third grade.
Okay. I was in Miss Dearborn's class. This is back when I'm from, if any of our listeners don't know, I was born in Baltimore. This is when I was back home.
I'm from Baltimore, that's why.
Yeah. I'm from Baltimore, that's why. That's good. I was in third grade, Miss Dearborn. I remember I dropped the glue stick one time. And it was like supposed to be silent. We were like doing a project or something. We had like made her mad or whatever, and I dropped the glue stick.
Oh no!
And
you don't cross Mrs. Dearborn like
that wasn't the problem. That I dropped the glue stick. The problem is that when I bent over to grab the glue stick, she thought that I said something to the person next to me in like a slimy, deceitful way, as if I had dropped the glue stick on purpose to, that's not what happened. I was just clumsy, and I got sent to the hall.
Damn.
Tough, huh?
And you know what happened that same year, or at least around that time? Young man who would eventually commit to Creighton was born while we were doing things like that.
And that's 3-star forward Jaden Kuhn out of Storm Lake, Iowa, the Creighton's first pickup in 2026, which is absolutely insane to say, as we were saying before I went on a third grade tangent about dropping a glue stick. And I was so taken aback by this when it was announced Thursday night, because one, I had just gotten out of the movies. I saw Final Destination. Yeah. It was okay. It was solid. But also because it's like May of 2025, and this is an early recruiting win.
Yeah.
Like, early. Because Jaden hasn't even, he like just finished his junior year of high school, he still has a year, and I don't think he's going to reclass. Like, that's not the intention here. Yeah. It's just he knew already. And Creighton sold him, as they do with most people, on a fit here or on a vision. Hey, here's how you fit here. Here's what we think you can be. Here's how we can develop you. And that was enough to get Jaden Kuhn to commit in the May before his senior season starts. No. So they're already on the board next year. They've already started adding to next year's roster.
Now, what's Creighton getting in Jaden Kuhn? What's he bringing to the table?
Yeah, really kind of one of those. He's like 6'6", 180, a guy who could play the 2 or 3, a slasher, a prolific slasher, I would say, like is comfortable finishing around the rim, can get to the rim off of cuts. And then obviously what kids do in high school is not what they're going to do in college, Fred Hoiberg, Greg McDermott, they're looking at these kids and saying, oh, they do this well, we can tune them to this, right? And so he has the ball in his hands a lot at Storm Lake, which just had one of the best seasons in program history.
I think anyone who's getting like high major Division I looks is going to be a guy who handles the ball a lot in high school.
But I don't think that will be his role at Creighton. I think he's going to be again a guy who plays like the 3 primarily, maybe a little bit of the 2, and is just really efficient with his cuts. and that helps him obviously create offense, whether it's for him or for others around the rim or driving kick opportunities or catch and kick, whatever it might be. But that's kind of what I think they're getting. I think they're getting a pretty rangy, a pretty athletic swingman in Jaden Kuhn. And he's a fringe top 100 prospect right now. I think that'll change as the year goes on. They've been recruiting him for a while, as have Iowa, Nebraska, Iowa State, a lot of other schools. And so I think he'll jump up the recruiting rankings as the year goes on, because I think he could have a special senior season in store. But the Jays are already on the board in 2026, which is nuts to say. So they've already started to add to next year's roster, and they still have a couple of spots open on next year's roster. Nebraska doesn't, because Nebraska's done.
Yeah.
With this year's roster.
That's right.
Next season's roster, however you want to look at it.
The upcoming season.
The upcoming
2025-26 roster.
Insane. We're only 6 months away. We're less than 6 months away from the start of the season. Yeah. How nuts is that?
Get back out there onto the high seas.
Get our sea legs back.
Yeah.